He called my husband a man of foundational bricks, and in that single phrase, I understood I had been relegated to the soil beneath them, essential but unseen and ultimately buried. The air in the funeral home was heavy with the scent of lilies, a sweet, cloying smell that clung to the back of my throat. David, my Robert's nephew, stood at the podium, his suit a sharp, dark cut against the soft lighting. His voice, practiced and smooth, wrapped the room in a performance of grief. He spoke of Robert's strength, his vision, his simple integrity. He told stories that were half true, polishing them until they reflected his own ambition. On the large screen behind him, a slideshow played. Pictures of Robert as a young man, handsome and full of life. Pictures of Robert on new construction sites, beaming with David's arms slung around his shoulders. Robert alone, looking out at the mountains we both loved. I appeared twice. In one, I was a blur in the background of a company picnic. In another, a distant figure on a porch. The 400 people in that room, friends and colleagues and neighbors, they were moved. They dabbed at their eyes with tissues, captivated by this story of a torch being passed so gracefully from a tired old man to his vibrant successor. I was being edited out of my own life, reduced to a footnote in the story of the company Robert and I had built with our bare hands and our whole hearts. As David's voice swelled to its somber conclusion, my purse, resting on my lap, gave a soft vibration. I glanced down, annoyed by the interruption. An email notification glowed on the screen. The sender's name was Robert Miller. My heart didn't just stop, it felt like it seized. The subject line was 3 simple words: "If you're reading this." My thumb, suddenly feeling old and clumsy, shook as I tapped the screen. It wasn't a letter full of goodbyes. It was one sentence followed by a long string of characters that I knew was a web link. The sentence read, "Eleanor, my love, he's not just stealing our company, he's stealing our name." Below it, a prompt for a passcode and a final message from my husband, a clue only I could decipher. The passcode is the name of that little diner in Savannah where I proposed, 1978. A cold fire started deep in my belly, a feeling I hadn't known in years. This wasn't a message from heaven. It was a failsafe, a final, brilliant move from the quiet strategist I'd loved for 45 years. The casseroles from grieving neighbors sat untouched on the counter. Each foil-covered dish felt less like a comfort and more like a paperweight, holding down a life that was no longer mine. The house Robert and I had designed, the one where every window was placed to catch a different light, was achingly silent. The silence felt like an accusation. I walked past the sympathy cards lined up on the mantelpiece, their kind words feeling like they were written for some other woman, some fragile, grieving widow. I was grieving, yes. My heart was a hollowed-out space in my chest, but I was not fragile, not anymore. My focus had narrowed to the phone in my hand, to Robert's last words. I dialed a number I knew as well as my own. "Maya," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "It's Eleanor." Maya is our goddaughter, a whip-smart IT security analyst down in Charlotte. She has Robert's mind for systems and my impatience for foolishness. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I read her the email, my voice low and even. On the other end of the line, I heard a sharp intake of breath, a silence that stretched for a few heartbeats, and then 2 words that were all I needed to hear. "I'm coming." She was there in 3 hours. That night, the aroma of stale lilies was replaced by the faint hum of my laptop. We sat at the big oak dining room table, the same one where Robert and I had signed the papers to found our company all those years ago. The passcode prompt glowed on the screen. Maya looked at me, her young face serious. "Are you ready for this, Aunt Eleanor?" I nodded, took a deep breath, and my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed the words that had changed my life once before, the words that were about to change it all over again. The Starfish Grill. The screen blanked, and then Robert's world, his last, secret world, unfurled before us. It wasn't organized by date, but by betrayal. My husband, a man who still preferred a pencil and graph paper, had taught himself how to build a fortress in the digital ether. It was a meticulously organized archive of his final year, a quiet rebellion fought from his favorite armchair. The first folder was labeled Video Calls. We clicked it. My breath caught in my chest. Screen recordings, dozens of them, showed David on video calls with Robert. David would be patient, his voice so kind, as he explained some complex financial projection. Then his finger would guide my husband's trembling hand on the screen of an iPad, guiding him to approve figures that I knew, even with a quick glance, were not the ones Robert and I had ever discussed. He was using Robert's good moments to legitimize lies. The next folder, Pocket Memos, was even worse. Robert must have carried a small recording device. We listened to audio files of David on the phone with developers, his voice stripped of the false sympathy he used around us. He was laughing, actually laughing, about how he'd finally be able to dissolve our company's low-income housing charter. He called our proudest achievement, the very soul of Blue Ridge Legacy Homes, dead weight. He was dismantling our legacy for profit, and he was bragging about it. Maya, ever the analyst, was silent, her face a mask of concentration. She pointed to a third folder, simply labeled Signatures. Inside, we found a chillingly consistent pattern. Dozens of documents, each with two versions sitting side by side. The first was the original contract Robert had seen and approved. The second was the manipulated version David had filed. Maya pulled up the metadata, the digital fingerprint on each file. "Look," she whispered, her voice tight with anger. The changes were made minutes after Robert's digital signature was applied. Every single time. He used a VPN to mask his location for the file uploads, Maya said, her eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It's a good way to hide your tracks. But he got sloppy. He forgot that digital signatures have their own geotag, a little pin dropped on a map every time a document is executed. Our dining room had become a war room, the table littered with empty coffee cups and my old legal pads filled with Maya's scribbled notes. She wasn't just my goddaughter offering comfort, she was an expert hunting on familiar ground, and her quiet fury was a balm to my own. She cross-referenced the signature timestamps with Robert's medical calendar, the one I kept with painstaking detail. Every doctor's appointment, every hospital stay, every bad day, and every good one. "This wasn't opportunistic, Eleanor," she said, turning the laptop toward me. A spreadsheet filled the screen, columns of dates, times, and locations lining up in a damning indictment. This was a plan. He waited for Robert's clear moments, got the signature, and then immediately implemented the fraudulent version. She traced two specific digital signatures, both tied to the most significant transfers of authority. They weren't done from the office or the hospital, she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. Both were routed through the server at David's old firm in New York, the one he was fired from. "I remember that call," Maya said suddenly, her head snapping up from a log file she'd been studying. "It was maybe 6 months ago. David called our help desk in a panic, said his old firm's server was compromised and that he needed help with a personal data recovery. He told my boss it was an old project portfolio he couldn't lose." My goddaughter's privileges ran deep in the tech world. With a few quiet keystrokes, she discreetly pulled the work ticket from that very job. The request from David was there in black and white, detailing his urgent need to access old, archived employment files. He had claimed, with a great deal of manufactured drama, that he needed to retrieve old design portfolios for a new pitch. It was a plausible story, and no one had thought to question it. But the access logs told a different story. Maya highlighted a section of code on the screen. He never went into the portfolio directory, not once. He made a direct path to his own human resources and finance records. He was a surgeon, not a browser, cutting a precise line to the one thing he wanted. He wasn't retrieving anything, Maya said, her face pale in the glow of the monitor. He was deleting. He was scrubbing his own history from that server. The question is, what was he so desperate to hide? This isn't just fraud, Maya stated, looking up from her screen, her professional mask firmly in place. The loving goddaughter had receded, and the sharp-eyed analyst was now in charge. The coordinated nature of the data manipulation, the use of the remote server, the timing, this is a constructed conspiracy. She walked me through it, step, painful step, her voice clinical and precise. The pattern was elegant in its cruelty. David would wait for a day when Robert was lucid, perhaps after a good night's sleep or a change in his medication. He'd bring him a document on the iPad, something simple, and get Robert to apply his digital signature. Then, within minutes, David would use the remote server in New York to access our company's secure drive. He'd replace the legitimate file with his altered version, the one that stripped away a piece of our legacy or transferred a fraction more control to him. The captured digital signature would now be affixed to a lie. The final step was to scrub the access log, making it look like the file had been there all along. It was a clean, repeatable, and deeply illegal process. As Maya continued to map out the network of deceit, tracing IP addresses and access points, she found one last file in Robert's digital vault. It was buried deeper than the rest, hidden in a subdirectory and protected by a second layer of encryption, one that was far more complex than the first. It was labeled simply, "The Real Leverage." While Maya began the slow, methodical work of cracking that second encryption, a different kind of memory surfaced in me. I went to the old filing cabinet in Robert's study, the one we kept old tax receipts in. It smelled of aged paper and cedar. I ran my fingers along the tabs until I found what I was looking for. I pulled out the original mission statement for Blue Ridge Legacy Homes, as if our values were just another asset to be accounted for. It was a single page, written in Robert's clear, strong architectural hand from 40 years ago. The centerpiece, the line he'd written in bold ink, was the provision for building and maintaining affordable, low-income housing in every community we developed. It wasn't a charity clause, it was our foundation. As I stood there holding that piece of paper, my phone buzzed with a text from Maya in the other room. It just said, "I'm in." I walked back to the dining room. My heart was pounding. "You need to see this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. On the screen was a scanned document. It wasn't a business contract. It was a confession, pre-signed and undated, written in David's familiar looping script. It was a detailed account of his embezzlement from that firm in New York, the very crime Robert had flown up and helped him cover up years ago. Robert had paid back the money, saved David from prison on two conditions: that he change his ways and that Robert hold on to this signed confession as insurance, a guarantee of a better path, a promise David never intended to keep. The confession lay on the screen, a digital ghost of a promise David had broken. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt the immense, sorrowful weight of Robert's foresight. My husband, the man who believed in handshakes and a person's word, had been forced to keep a receipt on his own blood. This changed everything. This wasn't just about manipulated contracts and corporate law anymore. This was about a pattern of criminal behavior. It was about character. We now had leverage that could not be dismissed or explained away. Well, Maya, ever practical, began backing up the file to 3 separate secure drives. I heard the mail slot click in the front door. I walked down the hall and picked up the small pile from the floor. Bills, a seed catalog, and on top, a thick, glossy invitation printed on heavy cardstock. The gold-embossed lettering gleamed under the hall light. It was an invitation to the Robert Miller Legacy Celebration, a fundraising gala scheduled for the following week. The event promised to launch a bold new company initiative honoring my husband's memory. The host and keynote speaker was listed at the bottom, David Miller. They had a portrait of Robert near the entrance of the ballroom, a handsome, smiling photograph from 10 years ago. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was engraved with a quote about integrity. It was something David had said at the funeral. The irony was so thick it nearly choked me. I moved through the gala in a simple black dress, a ghost at my own feast. David was masterful. He glided through the crowd of Asheville's most influential people, his face a perfect mask of humble grief and forward-thinking leadership. He accepted condolences for his beloved uncle and spoke with passion about continuing Robert's vision. Then came the keynote speech. He stood on a stage, under a spotlight, and announced the new initiative, dissolving the outdated and inefficient low-income housing charter to free up capital for a new line of high-end luxury condos. "It's what Robert wanted," he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. He wanted this company to be lean, profitable, and ready for the future. The guests, who only knew the story David had sold them, applauded his sharp business acumen. I remained silent, a statue in the corner of the room, observing, listening, gathering every lie. After the speech, an old board member, a man named George who'd played golf with Robert for 20 years, clapped David on the shoulder. "Robert would be so proud, son," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "He told me on his last good day that he wanted you to make the company leaner and more profitable. Your exact words, I believe." He mentioned the date. I knew that date well. It was a day Robert was in the ICU, unconscious and on a ventilator, unable to speak at all. Maya found our opening. "The junior accountant," she said, looking up from her laptop. "Sarah Jenkins. You and Uncle Robert hired her right out of college. She adored him." She was right. Sarah was a bright young woman, quiet and diligent. Robert had taken her under his wing. Maya reached out discreetly, sending a carefully worded email that hinted at irregularities without revealing our hand. Sarah responded almost immediately. She was terrified, but her loyalty to Robert's memory was stronger than her fear. We met her in a quiet corner of the downtown library, the smell of old books a comforting cloak of anonymity. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Miller was very specific," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the library entrance. "He said, all of Mrs. Miller's legacy files, all your project histories and founding documents were to be moved to deep archival storage. He called it streamlining the digital footprint." She confirmed David had been systematically building a wall around my access, erasing my institutional history piece by piece. She'd brought proof. Internal memos authorizing the file transfers, all signed with Robert's digital signature. Then she handed us a single printed log sheet. "This is from last Sunday night," she said, her finger pointing to a highlighted entry. David logged into the system as Robert to authorize the final charter dissolution papers, but look at the IP address. It wasn't the office. It wasn't from a local IP address at all. It was from the Charlotte Douglas International Airport. David was flying out of state for a luxury real estate conference at the very moment he was digitally impersonating my dying husband. The letter from my lawyer was 2 paragraphs, cold and formal as a winter morning. It stated, without emotion or embellishment, our intent to challenge the transfer of control of Blue Ridge Legacy Homes on the grounds of fraud and undue influence. The package that accompanied it needed no explanation. We didn't go to the board of directors. We didn't leak anything to the press. We went straight to the source of the rot. My lawyer sent the letter and the small, password-protected flash drive by registered courier directly to David's office. I imagined him signing for it, perhaps with a flicker of annoyance, thinking it was some routine legal matter. I imagined him plugging the small drive into his expensive laptop. There were only 2 files on it. The first was a high-resolution scan of his embezzlement confession from New York. The second was the airport server log, showing his IP address and the exact timestamp of him digitally impersonating Robert to dissolve the heart of our company. There were no threats, no demands, just the evidence, clean and undeniable. We were not asking for a fight. We were showing him he had already lost. The response came in less than an hour. It wasn't from his high-priced corporate lawyer. It came from David's personal email address. The subject line was blank. The message inside was a single, chilling sentence. "I will call you in 10 minutes. Please be alone." I took the call in Robert's study, surrounded by his books and the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago. Maya sat in a chair across the room, my phone on speaker, the microphone muted. His voice, when it came through the line, was not the smooth, confident baritone he used in boardrooms and at galas. It was the thin, brittle voice of a man who had been caught, a man whose carefully constructed world was shattering around him. There was no blustering, no denial, no threats, just a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke, the words small and defeated. "What do you want, Eleanor?" I leaned back in Robert's worn leather chair, the one with the permanent impression of his shoulders. I did not raise my voice. I did not list his crimes. I simply stated my terms. He would resign from the board and from the company, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. He would work with our lawyers to unwind every single change he had made to the company charter. He would walk away with nothing but the salary he had already been paid. And then he would disappear from our lives. There was no negotiation. My power was not in what I said, but in everything I left unsaid. My silence was the container for all the evidence we held. Another long pause stretched between us. "Fine," he finally whispered, the word sounding like broken glass. "But the confession? It gets buried. For Robert's sake. He wouldn't have wanted the family name shamed like that." There was no public accusation. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was just a quiet, official statement from the company announcing David Miller's immediate resignation to pursue other opportunities and to honor his uncle's original vision by stepping aside to allow for a return to the company's foundational values. It was polished. It saved face. But for anyone who knew how to read between the lines, it was a complete and total capitulation. An emergency board meeting was called, and they appointed an interim oversight committee to manage the transition. They asked me to serve as the lead advisor. I accepted. After the meeting, the company lawyer, a kind, decent man named Arthur, who had known Robert and me for 30 years, pulled me aside. He looked tired but relieved. He didn't say much, just slid a folded note across the polished mahogany table. I picked it up. On it, he had written a single line. "Robert always said you were the one who protected what mattered. You were right." The validation was quiet, but it settled deep in my bones, a warmth that pushed back against the chill of the past few weeks. I didn't pursue damages. The victory I needed wasn't financial, it was moral. My first act was not to punish, but to restore. The next morning, I went to the main office, a building I hadn't stepped foot in for over a year. I walked past the hushed reception area and went directly to the records department. I personally retrieved the original paper copy of the Blue Ridge Legacy Homes Charter from the deep archives where David had buried it. Holding the document, the paper soft with age, I drove not back to my house, but to our first community site. It was a small collection of homes we built for working families back in the 70s, a place born from the core promise of our mission statement. The early spring bulbs, crocuses, and daffodils were just beginning to push their green shoots through the last of the winter frost. It was a reminder that life and integrity always finds a way to return. Back in Robert's study, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, I placed the charter back where it belonged, inside our old, leather-bound company ledger. As I smoothed the page, my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope I'd never seen before, tucked into a pocket in the back cover. In Robert's familiar, strong handwriting, the label read, "For Eleanor." when the time is right. They didn't applaud when I walked into the conference room for the all-hands employee meeting. They just nodded, a quiet and profound gesture of respect. These were the people who had known Robert, who had worked alongside us for decades. They were carpenters and accountants, designers and site managers. They were the true legacy of our company. I didn't mention David's name. I didn't speak of betrayal or fraud. I simply unrolled the original charter on the long conference table for all to see, its promise once again the center of the room. I stated, in a clear, steady voice, that Blue Ridge Legacy Homes was returning to its founding principles. That was all that needed to be said. Later that evening, sitting alone on my porch, the Appalachian Mountains turning a deep purple in the twilight, I finally opened the envelope from Robert. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside, there was no confession, no final piece of evidence, no last instruction. It was the napkin from the Starfish Grill in Savannah from 1978. It was folded and worn, the paper fragile as a butterfly's wing. On it, in faded blue ink, was the first rough sketch he'd ever drawn of the floor plan for our future home. And beneath the drawing, he had written 6 words. For Eleanor, my foundation. I held the fragile napkin in my hands. The ink faded, but the lines still true. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving an open sky and cool, clean air. The story, our story, was finally written again, in a hand that could never be erased.